Yeah, it's great to be here. Gloria and I are old friends, and we've known each other since we attended the Whitney Independent Study Program together. Don't be afraid, the talk won't be like that. Since, when was that, 1997, I think is when we went. And I'm really excited to have her here. Before knowing Gloria's work on Stan VanderBeek's MOVIE-DROME, I wasn't actually very familiar with his work at all, and it's been really interesting to learn more about it. And I think she's written an incredibly coherent and concise and highly articulate and really interesting book about him. So I encourage you all to buy it now while you can. But I did have this little, I was slightly concerned because I thought, well, what do I have in common with Stan VanderBeek, and how are we going to make this interesting to anybody else? And then after sort of hashing it out a little bit, we realized there were a number of kind of points of convergence, and so we're going to try to emphasize that so that we both feel like we know what we're talking about today. So I actually thought that the last thing that Stan VanderBeek said in the film is maybe an interesting place to start. He said he wanted us all to reach out, communicate, balance our senses, and live a good life, which is very sweet, and also something that I'm like, I'm all for that. That sounds terrific. But I think it's particularly his emphasis at the end of this little video that we saw on communication. That might be a good place to start, because I don't think you hear a lot of experimental filmmakers talking about how important communication is and the sort of activation of their audience. That's not primarily what I think is their interest, and Gloria's done very careful work not to, and I should say the book is really about the MOVIE-DROME rather than Stan VanderBeek's entire oeuvre, and she's really gone to great lengths to talk about some of his ideas around agency and viewership. So I'd like to just start by that, if you could talk a little bit about your interest in ideas around communication via VanderBeek in this project.
Thank you. And first I want to say a quick thank you to Ethan Swan, Wendy Yao, and the entire staff at 356 South Mission. They're the most dialed-in group I've ever worked with.
Yeah, we call this the A-Team.
Yes. So it's been a real thrill and an honor to have the work presented in this environment, especially because as I am a transplant now from Los Angeles to Boston over the last 4 years, I've been at pains to really describe a lot of the differences, and I think I point to this space in particular here is a model of artist-driven discourse, right? So there's a very few moments when we get to come together as an academic, as a scholar, in the room with curators, with artists, and that's one of the primary things that I feel so honored and happy to come to look out and see that happens. This is a kind of organic intellectualism that is very germane to Los Angeles that I don't see happening hardly anywhere else. And so it's a very special moment to have this book presented here with Kerry's show, but also I think in the lifespan of this important programming and exhibition space. So it's a real honor to have that. I do think of that as a kind of marker. Also, because I am a historian, we're always looking in the glacial long time. Looking out now, there are many of you here who have witnessed, read, had studio visits with as I was cobbling this book together. And we work as scholars on a glacial time pace, which is very different from, I think, the pacing of contemporary art history. So one of the stakes I would say about communication, and tying back into your question, has to do with the stakes of a field, right? And so what I was really interested in at a certain moment was to ask that question, and a lot of it comes from doing studio visits with you, looking at multi-channel work, thinking about the kind of way, and you can see it in the film also, that artists are struggling to enter into a syntax for a grammar that does not quite exist, right? They're trying to articulate a set of praxes that they're looking at formulating with the work themselves. So that concept of communication, I think, is really vital and important because it comes out at a moment when someone like Susan Sontag is writing and talking about what was called the new cultural establishment, the moment that visual artists trained, as he says, painters, sculptors, photographers trained in visual art were looking outside of the field of art, in particular the rise of communication studies. This is the moment in the 60s when ideas around Norbert Wiener's writing, McLuhan, Buckminster Fuller were emanating outside of the rarefied worlds of academia and permeating, I would say, the general population. So as you see, there's a desire to think about art not just being specific to an art context, but how does it permeate the wider cultural environment. And that idea about communication as a model, I think, is really pertinent here. And so that's why I'm at pains to really think less about recovering a lost object from the 1960s, but to look back and see what methodologies and strategies artists are using to put into ideas into circulation.
Can you unpack a little bit? I mean, I had this vision of the MOVIE-DROME as this cool silo that you would sort of go in and trip out on. And before I knew about the MOVIE-DROME, I'd actually been to like Fritz Haig's place. We saw a screening there together many years ago, and the sense of sort of community that goes there. So could you talk a little bit about what this MOVIE-DROME was like, what it was like to go there, what the model was? Was it just this free-for-all, you go in and there's tons of crazy stuff going on and it's an escapist fantasy? What's going on in the MOVIE-DROME? What were his interests, in creating that kind of experience?
So first I would like to say, there's, anytime you think of like the imagery that you just saw, the mandalas, the kind of like a kind of very fast and loose appropriation of Zen mysticism or any kind of Eastern philosophy, I mean, these are all sort of very problematic issues in the work, I just want to that's, first and foremost, I want to say that. The other thing is that there's multiple versions of the 60s, right? So there is a tendency to think about anything having to do with this type of moment as a kind of counterculture, DIY, agitprop moment. And looking out in the room today, we have curators and scholars who work on a range of differentiating what has become a very homogenized version of that decade. So I feel like my work is trying to add and buttress different versions of debates about that. There's the plurality of the 60s that becomes generative to think about the current conditions for contemporary art. So I would say first and foremost, the drome starts off as a manifesto. It's not a built object. It's actually a prototype. And that's one of the claims that I make in the book, is that very clearly he's interested in thinking about this as a prototype, as a different model of distribution for art and ideas, communication, but also the thinking about the way that these structures are supposed to be worked out. So, for example, in 1965, he writes a manifesto called Culture Intercomming, where he lays out these ideas, and very much coming out of Fluxus, and the idea of a manifesto as a kind of provocation is at the heart of this. So I would say, arguably, that the MOVIE-DROME is a conceptual apparatus. It's not a built space. It exists as a conceptual idea that was meant to be sort of replicated and prototyped. So what he did was to kind of think about building an interface, and you can kind of see the language that he's talking about here. So it's less about the specificity of the object, but the material conditions of it were that he mail-ordered a grain silo from a farm manufacturer, right? Had it shipped to upstate New York, and built on the land, which was an artist cooperative. And this is a moment also to think about, and the reason I'm interested in this moment, because again, as a contemporary art historian, I'm interested in the parallels of a certain moment in which we want to constantly talk about in the current moment the stress on artists, the economic pressures being brought to bear on the work, which are paramount, and we look at this moment in the 60s as somehow liberatory, utopic. And the reason Merce Cunningham, John Cage, M.C. Richards, the wine ribs, they go out to 35 miles north of Manhattan, it's because they can't afford to live in the city anymore. And this is in the middle of the 1960s, right, 64. So the economic boom that we all want to talk about now it's parallel to that moment. And so they go up there and it's on an artist cooperative. And so that's also one of the other concepts of the drome that I'm interested, is the concept of a cooperative, not a collaborative, and not a lab or kind of DIY archigram or a kind of counterculture model. They're not interested in a counterculture. This is not part of that kind of rhetoric around that. And it really comes out of a paradigm of aesthetic practice that sort of stems from a pedagogical treatment at Black Mountain College.
I want to poke you a little more about that question because you make a distinction in the book between, what are the words you use? This is when we're talking about like absorption and immersion, right? Which is something that and so of course being an artist, I'm totally narcissistic, so I read art history and it's like maybe it has nothing to do with me, but I immediately find, okay, this is my point of entry, this is what I want to talk about, so I'll talk about that. But I think about, in my own work, a kind of trying to strike a balance between like what is the sort of minimal point of identification and empathy for a viewer? And, can you know that something is extraordinarily highly constructed? Can you be aware of your presence as a subject watching something, not being completely lost into it. Yet there is, for example, in my work Behind the Wall, a real attempt at having an immersive experience. I corral everyone onto a little carpet among all these speakers with the idea that this is sort of the ideal position in which to see it. So there's something sort of there's a tension there. And I think you nicely lay out a kind of, you point to a kind of idea of the sort of false criticality, or I think you call it like the sort of false promise of agency of a viewer just because they can come and go. So just getting a little more specific about how the audience engaged with one another and with the technology and with what they were experiencing in the movie-drome as a kind of, how self-aware were they, and how much was it about a kind of onslaught or chaotic collection of films and things playing all at once? I mean, that's not a very clear question, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
Right, so I think there's two things that are at play. So for those of you who have never heard of Vanderbeek or never heard of the Movie-Drome, there's a way in which the point of entry for many people in terms of the public consciousness of his work was as a filmmaker. He was part of what was called the New American Cinema that was really interested in thinking about making film as a kind of art form that would be aligned with the handheld. He's the progenitor of stop motion animation. He's really important collagist. So there's a whole way in which his work is already circulating within a film context, right? So that was the established narrative that I was writing within or against or parallel to. So just to kind of foreground that. Then there's another group of people who may be familiar with expanded cinema in the 1960s in this moment, and the drome is a very iconic, known sort of entity, and there's a tendency to, I think, kind of exalt this project as some kind of precursor to the internet, which is clearly something that I'm trying to mine in this book. And I really wanted to slow down that illusion between what happens in the 1960s and what happens in digital culture. So yes, I think that, one of the points that I want to say is that the radical move is not to envision a conceptual proto-theater in which images are meant to be bombarded by the viewers to be bombarded by these roving images or this visual velocity or flow. That's not the radical move, to say that, just to subject the viewer to multi-screen images and sounds that don't correlate. The radical move for me was to kind of conceptualize these films, what you saw here, as variable media, all to be sort of generated for multi-use, that these things were not sort of unlike film, and especially at that moment, he's writing and working against the kind of essential film of Jonas Mekas and the Anthology Film Archive, the idea that we have like a modernist version of an original source in which everything else is a derivative or a copy, right? So that's the radical move, is to put into play this idea that things aren't fixed, right? To be comfortable with ambiguity and indeterminacy. And that, to me, is the interest at that point, right, is to kind of put these things in play and to kind of create a sense, not that the viewer is liberated and has a choice merely because they can get up and walk out, but because we've reconceptualized the ways in which the temporal quality and the value system around where the work is. So the question for me in the Movie-Drome, in Vanderbeek's work, is not what is the work or what is the medium specificity of film, but what does it do? What's the behavior? And that's what I'm trying to nuance.
You talk a little bit, and we've talked a little bit about a kind of, I think you call it like a reverse chronology, and about sort of discovering, not trying to recuperate a lost moment from the past that will tell us so much about the future, but actually kind of moving back from the present in your own interests, in your own work. Maybe that's something to...
Absolutely. I mean, it's doing studio visits, looking at Jennifer West's work, looking at your work, being with, Shauna Lucker, other people who I learned from in terms of thinking about the questions around this work really came out of a way to think about, like I said, that question around language and how to think about communication structures that break down. How do you create something that's not about representation in a one-to-one ratio? So these were the lessons that I learned from the artists that I work with. And for me, especially, was to also think about Laura Owens' work in these paintings. And when I got to write an essay for her, or an exhibition at Kunsthalle Zurich, part of the condition for me was, when I said to her, Laura, I don't write about painting. And she's like, that's precisely why I want you to do this, right? And to me, it was to really think around the specific histories that get narrated around material and medium specificity, and to work against and around those. And that's the lesson that I took from Laura Owens's work very much, and also the sense of a sociability within the paintings themselves, and how they constantly drew from different strategies and methodologies. So those were the lessons, I would say, reverse the kind of anachronistic way as a historian that I work. That all started from looking at the current conditions of art now, and mining it backwards. And the other stake for me was to say that contemporary art offers its own paradigms and its own feedback mechanisms. Because the minute that you have an artist who works in time-based media, the tendency is to run that work through a kind of theoretical lens or a screen, a la Deleuze, or to kind of think about Christian Metz and sort of film apparatic theory, right? So anytime that typically happens, and what I'm interested in is to say, what are the mechanisms and methodologies within that artists themselves, the strategies for analysis that the artists themselves place within the work? And that's where I'm looking at communication, I'm looking at these models of the interface that Vanderbeek is pointing to, that announce their own methods of analysis within the work themselves. And that comes from the studio visits we've had, and thinking about this notion right now that I'm interested in, which is not just representing something, but finding a kind of but thinking about what the work does, meaning looking at a commensurability, right? Not to say that this is an illustration or a narrative, but thinking about what is the commensurative experience for the viewer within the work itself. And we see that happen within the 3-channel piece that you have here. And consistently through your work, that's been the kind of question, right? Not representation, but to me, for the viewer, a kind of something commensurate with an experience.
Yeah, I mean, what's one thing that I think about a lot with my own work, I think it's sort of like, it's the kind of thing I'm not supposed to say in a talk. I think it's really uncool that I care so much about my viewer, and I care like so much about sort of civic engagement, and it's like really important to me that we can have a talk like this with art historians in the audience, and artists in the audience, and school teachers in the audience, but also that, for me, because there's very often human subjects and human consciousness, but it's very specific and unique consciousnesses of particular individuals with their own somatic experiences. For me, one of the reasons to even sort of like why make the work in this context rather than in a traditional cinematic space is that it affords a possibility to, say, have a room full of objects that you might encounter once, watch the film, encounter a second time, and have a new read on. And that's sort of something that, I'm fortunate in that the gallery that I work with, Brian Butler's space, has 2 floors, and so I know my audience will always pass through the first floor before the second and pass through it again. And this has a kind of similar layout in that you have this sort of unfolding over time experience. Long story short, I think all of this is, for me, an interest in trying to, what I might call a kind of like performativity in the work, that the work, rather than trying to represent or illustrate what it might be like to have aphasia and not be able to speak. These are the causes of aphasia. Here's what people look like when they speak with aphasia. Rather, what would it look like if the film was aphasic, or what would it look like if the space sort of became aphasic? So, I hope I'm understanding you correct when you talk about commensurability of experience. It's about a kind of embodying, presumably maybe phenomenologically or cognitively, the kind of state of. In Vanderbeek's case, a kind of post-war realization of a kind of soon-to-come onslaught, and maybe it was already kind of happening, of images, and that sort of overpowering deluge of images, and so the question for me often becomes, how do you develop a critical relationship to that, and not simply reiterate it in the practice? And I think there is a tendency in a lot of media artists today to sort of ostensibly be commenting on the kind of troublesome short attention span while actually probably reproducing it through the work. Right. So maybe that's
there's a lot of, and I think that's really important now in the current moment when there's a kind of rush to I think assign the sense of that, work is somehow representative of a digital culture, right? Or the kind of sped up way in which we scan and don't read images, right? And in reality, I think those are things that are symptomatic. Are they critical of them? Or are they symptomatic of that condition, right?
Well, and it would seem also like the end game for Vanderbeek, the way one would want to position it, is to say, oh, look, he's using computers. Better computers will beget better image making. The drawings he'll make will become increasingly realistic. Pretty soon, he'll be making Avatar. I mean, there is this sort of teleological end game to technological development, which is virtual reality and a kind of simulated reality that's so much more pleasant to be in, or
Absolutely,
interesting,
right.
or thrilling than the one that we live in. And it seems like with the MOVIE-DROME, and just to return again and again to my insistence on sort of audience, is that when you're hot and sweaty and aware of the presence of bodies around you, something else happens. I mean, for me, I've started to realize, I think through this project, that one of the driving forces or interests for me is how can it really be that we're all we're all in the same room right here, all of us have our brains, we're all having our own experience, and yet we think that we're communicating.
Right.
And what happens when you meet people that don't have access to language functioning in the way it normally does, who can actually nevertheless communicate in profound, beautiful, meaningful ways with one another and with all of us. So, to me, the fact that that Vanderbeek seems to have an interest in, balancing our senses and having a good life. I mean, it sounds naive, and I think I often sound naive, but to you, the kind of playing loose and fast with Eastern mysticism, it doesn't actually strike me as problematic.
Right.
It strikes me as a kind of important ingredient in that sort of early encounter with media overload and and a kind of hope for the future, like that maybe this can somehow be integrative and building networks, like the idea that the MOVIE-DROME was a prototype for these things that would exist all over the world to bring us closer.
Right, so I mean, that's the other thing. The other word that no one wants to use, the label of a humanist, right? So he's very much a humanist at that point, when being a humanist is not cool, and even in the current moment, right? So to think about these very humanist themes of, connecting with one another and the sort of universal kind of goals about communication that would exceed cultural difference, right? That's what I meant about the kind of fast and loose and playing, right? So one of the things I'm interested in is in that bringing bodies together, and the point is not so much about a kind of homogenization as it is a much more about difference and the location of that difference. Because the minute you bring up all of these multi-channel works and the layering effect, in particular for me, it's not about how all images are the same, but really what becomes the critical stakes of that operation is to look at the glitches, when it's different, when it breaks down. And I think that's why we, like Vanderbeek in the literature, there is a way in which, like you said, a teleological way in which we get Avatar, or this extraordinary digital refinement. If we look at this film, and if you look at the results, I argue that there's no way we get to the digital seamlessness of current conditions through this work. This is about break, this is about collage, this is about fragmentation, this is about editing, and it's about, for me, a composite. So what I argue is that we have an accretive model of change, and again, because there's such a rhetoric around the rise of computing, digital programming as a way to de-skill or to automate laborious activities, right? That there takes no talent, the new talent, the computer here, like literally kind of being brought to bear. And the point that I want to make is that this kind of, like photography for conceptualism, computer programming within animation in this type of work is labor intensive. It's absolutely hard to deal with. There are quotes in the book in which he's saying learning this computer program that you saw to generate the poem field in particular was akin to pushing a pencil up the wall with your nose, right? So that part of what I'm interested in is these rhetorics of de-skilling, of programming that happen. And that's just one aspect of that. And the humanist side of it is very much on play, because if you, in the other poem fields, in number 7 in particular that he writes, I mean, he makes this very plaintive, no more war, right? And this is in the moment, the MOVIE-DROME is not about a technology as much as it is about a kind of ethos that develops in the kind of, like I said, the sort of woody backyard of an artist's cooperative on a sloping backyard, but it's also situated within the kind of cultural milieu of the civil rights movement, of the computing industrial complex, all at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, that makes me just think about how, like, I think that one question that sort of circulates for me in this project and in others is how trauma is represented, and how, if you kind of buy, as I do, this sort of Lacanian idea that trauma is somehow outside of representation, that it's often through a kind of excess of representation that one can get a better sense of the real or something. And so it sounds like, in a way, that that might have been at play too in this practice, in that particular historical moment.
Yeah, and the same thing, like why I'm interested in having this talk here at 356, why we gather in the room. And I feel like, again, the rhetoric around social media, sociability, about access and conversation is that, at the end, for me, again, that term radical is something that I wanted to trouble and I think is problematic, because I think twofold. One is, the other thing that's really a bad word is not only humanist, but pedagogy and teaching, right? And the other thing to remember, I think, and especially in Los Angeles, when there is such a sort of sort of deep, innate discussion around art schools and all of that discourse that's happening right now. And one of the things I'm interested in about VANDERBEEK'S work is thinking about media and pedagogy that are at stake in this, right? The idea of media teaching its own tools and the way that that has a kind of interest in the work itself. The idea of a civic discourse that we have lost discussion around, right? So for me, this work, the idea that he's interested in having residencies at WGBH, at NASA, at CBS, kind of, for me, triangulates this idea that the art world is bifurcated on the commercial versus the academic, the radical versus the sellout. And I think he offers, in this kind of articulation of where the work resides and how it circulates, a different kind of civic model that we haven't really been discussing within contemporary art.
Yeah, and you differentiate between, like, a civic model and a community model. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is that? I mean, what I like about civic is that it implies citizenship and a certain responsibility and a kind of engagement in a sort of political body,
right?
In a way that maybe community is just too fluffy.
It's not fluffy, but again, it's the interest that I have about the specificity of that language that's being emanating from the artists themselves. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in a term like expanded cinema, because this is really a way that artists were trying to articulate a way to move beyond the excess, this kind of medium specificity question. So I'm trying to take my cues from the artists themselves. So they're talking about civics and civil discourse. They're looking at civil disobedience, that this is the kind of historical language that is emanating from those debates, rather than what happens when we look at this moment now, writing about the past. We want to kind of create a kind of intellectual history for artist social practice, or we want to create an intellectual history for this other kind of discursive moving image work, right? And those are not the stakes of my project. And that's why I'm looking at the specificity of that language. Because, like I said, and it comes all from these types of discussions. The research and material are there. This book was written before there was any semblance of a VANDERBEEK archive. This was when Mara McCarthy and others were interested in, this was like the first moments in 2008 when we had a chance to actually start to lay out what the work is or where the work is and ask some of those questions. And it's still not fixed, right? So part of it for me was to kind of look at the tapes, the audio recordings, why we record these events now. It's for scholars to go back, we historians and curators, we all go back in and look at that record, and we're all part of, and that's one of the things that becomes important to me in a space like this, and having worked with many of you out there, is to say that it's not just historians who write the historical record. It's within contemporary art. It's the archivists, the programmers that we all work with. It's the artists themselves whose own interpretation coalesce into the historical record. And I feel like those are the methodological stakes for a project like Expanded Cinema, which did not work in the same trajectory of other moments of practices of that period.
Well, one other thing that I know you were interested in talking about that this just reminds me, I'd like to that maybe we just talk for 3 or 4 more minutes and then open it up to Q&A. But I remember, and I don't remember exactly how you were framing it, but one of the things, as we're like a couple of days away from the end of this show for me, is I feel a little bit sad, because, you put all this work in and then you make a show and then it goes away and you don't know when it's going to pop up again. But also for me, this project is quite autobiographical. As you know, as someone who's followed my work, it references, not that it references, but it's sort of, using tools that I've developed over lots of projects. I'm sorry, I'm not talking into the mic. Over lots of projects for a long time. But really specifically, it's kind of about this space too. And for those of you that haven't seen the film, much of it was shot in this space. So there's no place else you can show it. It's kind of like a performance in a way, because there's nowhere else. It'll never be shown again here, obviously, and if it's not shown here, it's never shown again in the space that it was made. So there's a kind of collapsing of the site of production and the site of reception for me that made a lot of sense in this project, because the problem that people with aphasia have, there are two regions of the brain that are affected in aphasia, one of which is responsible for understanding incoming language and one of which is responsible for producing language. And it felt like a nice, analog to what an artist goes through, which is a sort of struggle to articulate through one's work what it is one wants to articulate, to find that right form, put it out in the world, and then let it go. And then there's the question of what the audience makes of it. And so in a rare opportunity like this, where the exhibition space briefly becomes your studio, there is that kind of collapsing, the way there is for the aphasia between those regions of the brain. But you were interested in this, I think, because of a kind of folding in of the documentation of work of this nature. And I don't remember exactly where that went, but do you? Because that's something I think we wanted to talk about.
I mean, for me, again, I think that becomes the question for this type of work. We're at point of access and accessibility, right? And how much of that kind of pre-background do you have to know in order to have the experience that you want the audience to have, or that, it has to do with what Vanderbeek would call, or actually John Cage writing about Vanderbeek would say this was a disavow of intentionality, right? Because there's a certain point in which, and that's why your work, that kind of knife's edge about instrumentality and agency are really on the same pathway, right? To kind of think about where the viewer lies in that. So in terms of documentation, I'm just constantly interested. Again, I'm a historian, so we think about this, and one of the charges that I always have is to think about where does the work lie? It's not in this, is it in this moment of the space here at 356 during this duration? How do we have access it in the future? Where does the imagery come from? What becomes the kind of distillation for the project? How do we recover and bring it back into a certain moment? And these are constantly processes of interpretation, right, at a certain moment, and especially when, and it's just an antidote or a counter to thinking about, again, one of the critiques always of contemporary art is that, oh, well, people look at it on a website and I've got it and I move on to the next thing, right? This idea that I'm interested in, it's not just thinking about a kind of knee-jerk reaction to say that you have to have a real experience versus looking at it through those things, but meaning that mediation is really what this, we have to have a more nuanced sense of what mediation means, I think, in the current moment. And that's what I meant about documentation. So it's not that we can actually know the work as a whole, but to really begin to foreground those points of mediation within the work, both in the present and then historically and then in the future, right? Again, I'm always thinking in glacial terms. Like you guys work much faster than we do, right? So those were, I would say those are like the main points that the kind of affinities. And the last point I just want to make about this, and is that question of affinities and how moving away from typology of medium specificity, what then are the organizing principles? And that's why I'm so happy to have the book at Ooga Booga, because I feel like it enacts a sense of affinity, right? The organizing structures are through chance, and encounter what I would call the kind of ways in which affinities work for that. There's no reason otherwise, right? And then how the work comes together here. And I think those are the gestures that I'm interested in now, and I feel like that is quite a special thing. And again, thinking about not to say that is a counter narrative, and that's really the important thing for me to think about right now within the field, is nuancing these positions. It's no longer just the radical versus the sellout. It's no longer the kind of establishment or institutional museum versus the alternative space. I think the landscape is absolutely much more porous, and these shifts are quite interesting to think about right now. And so I would like, in terms of the critical reception, I think our charge is to come up with a nomenclature or a language that is equally, if not commensurate, with that kind of shift in landscape.
Well, on that note, shall we open it up? My plan is to be, oh, great, I was going to say we'll be quiet until there's a question. Oh, look, there's lots of them. I think we're supposed to ask you to wait until the microphone comes your way.
Thank you. Gloria, in your comments, you talked about being interested for you, the radicality of the drome was that it was a work that kind of existed or was imagined to exist as a prototype, that it would have different iterations, that it was a kind of format that would travel across different platforms. And as far as I understand it, the drome has had a life and it has been reconstructed close to our present moment, and you have consulted on its reconstruction. So I was hoping you could talk about how the work exists materially now and what have proven to be the kind of materials minima of the drome as an object as it has become kind of a museological object.
I mean, that's why I mentioned the kind of idea that this still remains an interpretive project for me, because when, for example, in 2012, the new museum wanted to install it on the 3rd floor as part of the Ghost in the Machine exhibition, right? So the question became less about recovery. Do you have a conceptual decision to make? Is it about a kind of fidelity to an object that's raw? It exists still at the land, 35 miles north of Manhattan on that artist cooperative. Do you go up there and sort of dig it up, the remaining detritus of that space and what was now still exists and is a kind of work-live space for another artist who inherited that space? Is that the object, right? Or is it you take the kind of concept that it's really a manifesto? And that was the debates that we had, I thought were really generative about that. To me, it brings up this question of fidelity. And it's not about a kind of, again, finding a true lost object and polishing it and finding that unique thing. It was really to say, in our debates, do you take this as a precept for a conceptual apparatus? And then to kind of run it through that. And that's what we did in the new museum, to kind of think about why it would be okay then. I mean, because again, it's anathema for most experimental filmmakers to transfer their material to high 8, to have it sort of pieced together in that kind of installation. And so really it wasn't about a fidelity to a lost object at that point. And so the decisions that we all made together, especially with the estate, were really important to think about the idea of transfer and thinking about media not being fixed or stable, but to kind of think about the next iteration of that, it being iterative. So I think that's the material condition for it. I think also thinking about it as a manifesto that could be, as all the lessons from Fluxus, from conceptual art too, to kind of think about how do you own these things, what are the instructions, I think all of those issues are coming into play right now.
I think there was a question over here somewhere.
Where was this? Was at Black Mountain?
The drome itself? Nope, it was...
Or the artist collective?
Yeah, it's in Stony Point in New York.
Stony Point, so that's the island?
Nope,
on
it's
Long
north.
Island?
It's like on Route 9 if you go past the George Washington Bridge for about 35 miles.
And then take a left?
Yep.
Okay. Because I was wondering at the time, you were saying, yes, it's economics that forced people north, but I mean, wasn't Allen Ginsberg up there? Wasn't there a whole movement out of the 50s that also people were up there as a kind of Bob Dylan, you know? What was this idea of making work in nature?
Right.
Where there's all these negative ions because of all the waterfalls and the creeks, and it's very beautiful, right? But there must have been a movement, you know, that is many movements up to the country, up to the woods, right?
It definitely, I should reverse that. So yes, the physical space, the geographic space is 35 miles north of Manhattan in Stony Point, New York, in an area called The Land. Now this was financed through Vera Williams, and who were sponsors and on original faculty from Black Mountain College. So when the college dissolves in 1954, and Black Mountain, for those of you who don't know, and there'll be a major exhibition in the fall that's traveling that looks at that history, is a progenitor for sort of Bauhaus in the United States. It's got a whole other kind of legendary rhetoric that I think will be re-examined a little bit more nuanced this fall. But so Vanderbeek, Cage, Cunningham, they're all in dialogue with each other at Black Mountain College. So the term that comes out of this is the idea of an intentional community, right? So that they want to go up there to create an intentional community. And this is also thinking about Karen Carnes, who's a potter at this time, MC Richards, who is also a scholar, a literature scholar and translator for this group of avant-garde artists at that time.
Okay, so what was I fucking the aphasia, the civic-mindedness or civicness of thought, right, and the being in the countryside, away from that's interesting to me. That's, they seem counterintuitive. Oh, I want to be with the people and be civic-minded, but I'm up here in the woods, right? And then its relationship to this communication medium, or, maybe you could address that a little bit.
So deep in the book, I'm convinced that Vanderbeek is actually deeply inspired by the writing of MC Richards, who writes a pottery manual called On Centering. And I argue that it's really a manual for subjectivity, where you take, he literally says, and she literally says, where you take and reshape. So for me, going to the land, and again, it wasn't a kind of counterculture dropout, rhetoric of that period. He's not steeped in that kind of logic or language. What he's interested in my opinion, like you're saying, is that it is an interesting idea to think about the so much of the experimental, radical 1960s takes place against an urban backdrop. And then this is a specifically rural situation in which they are. Karen Carnes' pottery is funding the life of these people. Their children are being educated in a kind of communal fashion. It's not a commune, again, very clear. But thinking about this idea of an intentional community, people who have a shared ethos. And again, alongside the word civic, I would put the word ethos in there as another kind of terminology that is talking about a sort of shared interest, right? So those are, I think, very much at play.
And this was a very white world, right?
It continues to be one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just something about the civic in there also.
Right. Yeah.
Can you talk a little about the if the movie drums were going to be all over the world, would they? What's the reproduction that I saw that you guys put together at the New Museum? So all of that was archival imagery, right? And it was all created by Vanderbeek. And sort of the proposal that he makes about using technology in the film is that it's about everybody having access to the technology and having access to generating the images. And I was thinking in terms of this like teleological future, not the non-avatar future that is coming soon. How I wondered about the role that the visitors would have had in generating the imagery in the ideal.
In the earlier iterations?
Well, if the drone was everywhere.
Right. So for him, it comes to open calls. So through Radical Software, other journals of the period, film culture, actually. So alongside advertisements that Andy Warhol made for EPI tryouts, you'll see advertisements or calls for Vanderbeek to solicit material. Give me your broken equipment. I'm soliciting 35mm slides. Give me your home movies. So really, it was an open call for not just his own. It wasn't a kind of presentation module for that wasn't the perfect screening venue for his own work. It was really a call to say, give me your cast off. I'm interested in your donations of broken equipment, of your own slides. It was really those open calls or solicitations. And it's interesting because it is the 1965 film comment issue where you have Warhol, like I said, soliciting for EPI, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, and he's taking out ads at the same time. And for all kinds of 8mm, 16mm, give me your, slides and things like that.
And how much were they, oh my God, how much were they, like a view, if I went to, Madras and there was one there, and I went inside, could I then bring images inside or manipulate some of the images that were maybe on one of the display mechanisms
Right, and this
to
is where,
send to somebody in, Eugene,
well,
Oregon.
the highest level of technology of that time was a proto-fax machine. And so the idea that images could be faxed and shared with each other was, I think, the kind of working model at that time. And a funny moment came up in publishing the book, and this is also, I think, an age difference too, because the copy editor, when you send your manuscript out, then you go to a copy editor that you've never met before, they ask you a series of questions, and one of them was on this fax mural. So he does a fax mural later in 70 between the Smithsonian and the Walker Art Institute and MIT. And so one of the statistics, or one of the points of information I had to write was to say, this is a fax mural in which it took a week to transmit, and this is something that Mara McCarthy did at the Box, right, was to actually transmit this fax mural through graphic paper. And the copy editor kept saying, well, aren't these supposed to be inches and minutes? And I was like, no, they're feet and days or hours, and that's the difference. Is
Glacial pace.
Right, to think about that. And this is in 1969 and 1970, and that was an experiment also that was done in the gallery in 2008 here, because to think about that kind of idea, to counter the idea that this is all seamless, fast, instant, to really think about the mechanics of transmission as being slow, like I said, subject to technical difficulties, and often broken.
But it was a collaboration with the sort of bottom line is it was a collaboration with the viewers.
Yeah,
in the space.
and I think for him it was really about libraries, what we would call, he called them newsreels, he called them libraries, we would call them like your Flickr stream, I don't know, this idea that all of this content was being generated and donated by other users. So he was interested in finding those people and bringing in their personal libraries of newsreel of material.
Okay, last hot
Yeah.
mic hog. And then in the video that's here, was there the generating the images for each of the people that you interviewed? That I wonder about how the images came up.
Here in Symmetrics?
Well,
or-
I'm asking Kerry Tribe
Kerry.
about
Oh,
it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you restate the question? I was trying to picture that question referring to what we saw and having a hard time. Ask me
no,
again, please.
sorry, yeah, I was pointing.
That's cool.
I was
Yeah.
pointing through the wall.
Through the wall, right, of course. Well, I
I-
do that too. I point right through the wall on my film.
I was just wondering, just thinking about people generating images,
Yeah.
and that watching the film is part of it is imagining these images being generated by the speakers as well as you generating them
Right.
in conversation with the speakers. So I just wonder about how they came about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was quite a structural development in that I knew the participants very well, and I'd known them all for well over a year before I started interviewing them for the project, and so I knew, for example, that for the guy Chris, who was a photographer, that this rock collection was really important to him and interesting to him, and that he had made this book about the killing fields in Cambodia at the same time in 1998 or 7 or 8 when I had made a project about something very different, but also about sort of a failure of memory and what one does when there's no archive documenting things that have happened in the past. And I saw, I basically went to this support group and explained that I was an artist and I was interested in doing something on aphasia, and I was an open book and I would answer any questions or whatever. And so the next week I brought my catalog of my work, and the week after Chris brought a catalog of his work, and we were kind of looking at each other sort of stunned because I felt I was looking at someone who had a very parallel experience and was interested in the same things, and at the same moment was making sort of similar work that I was very interested in. And that kind of put the fear of God in me, because that level of identification, it was really like, this really could be me. I mean, I could be in your position right now and you could be in mine. And so it proceeded quite organically in the sense of the sort of content that would make sense for each person. But what was maybe more sort of driving the choices of imagery had to do with the pacing and editing, and that it became quite clear to me that, because I started out picturing the subjects, shooting them with video, and as every time I showed anyone that footage, there was this really uncomfortable, I can't stand to watch them suffer. And I didn't have that experience. They weren't suffering, they were speaking in their own way. But that was a problem, and it occurred to me at a certain point when I was editing, I just started cutting footage from Chris's contact sheets he shot in Cambodia. When you make that image that was this big and too small to see, sort of almost too big to see, of course, I was looking at my computer and imagining it being too big to see. And when you cut it sort of staccato the way he speaks, he suddenly becomes this kind of voice of God and has a tremendous authority. And I felt anyway, as the viewer, who was also the editor, like, you really know what you're talking about. You have a kind of authority and presence, and I want to listen to you. And that felt like, okay, that's the right choice for this person. And so he's always got like these stills that are sort of either too close or too far. For Dale, who is the Vietnam vet, he has this kind of aphasia that operates on a more metonymic axis, and there's, rather than sort of substitutions, there's this kind of slipperiness to the way he speaks. And I immediately thought, okay, for him, we need to have all sort of horizontal tracking shots and move through space in a kind of way where you think you're seeing one thing and then it slips into another. Because he had this idea to make a children's television cartoon about a magical land where musical notes could go and, through cooperation and, community involvement could understand each other finally, it was like, well, that's exactly what this aphasia poetry, or reading group and support group that you belong to is, and in a way that's, that will become the sort of driving metaphor for him. And so I knew I wasn't going to picture him, but it made sense to have him be these sort of animated avatars that, he begins as a canary, and then when he becomes a seal, and then he gets attacked by leeches in Vietnam and becomes a Hollywood producer, so he had to be a leech, So it is, it was very slippery, and it was much more intuitive making this film actually than anything else I've done, and there were a lot of moments when I thought, how do you justify this? This is fucked up, this is problematic. But I did work really closely with the three subjects and sort of brought them in and used them as a sounding board and checked out what sort of felt right and didn't. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah, and then just to touch on the last person, Laura Romero, who's the female subject in the film, has this, because she can't hear what she doesn't have such a problem with language production. Her problem is with language reception. So she, as she says in the film, she can speak faster than she can understand. So she'll start saying something, not be sure she said it right, start again, rephrase it, start again. So there's this way that there's a kind of sort of trying, restating, trying again, and that's how all of her footage is cut. And it's her house, those are her books, that's the bush she actually fell into. Yeah. Maybe
Any more?
one more question if there is it, and then we call it a night. Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, you should ask. Yes, please. Do we want to? You know about that, Sarah?
What I think is so remarkable about this event is this culmination of the conversations you two have had over so many years, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about, in relationship to this particular project, what you two talked about as it was forming and how you did it, especially now that you're not in the same location. And just so much of this seems to be about communication and engagement and interaction through imagery, and I'm sort of meandering around a point. But what I think is really quite resonant and meaningful about this is sort of this gathering of all of these different ideas, and in particular, these two individuals that have had this ongoing engagement and discussion around how media and image, and moving image in particular, and the different applications of that can resonate and impact an audience and engage many different people within the community. So,
Yeah.
and just, because you met at Whitney?
Yeah,
program?
yeah.
So just to see, your conversation evolve and also your work evolve over that time, and if you could speak a little bit about that, just as for the archive.
Sure. Well, one thing I'll just say, the first thing that comes to mind is that there was a very, for me, the stakes of this project felt quite high. I really wanted not to fuck this up, particularly because of the people it was about. And because I was working in a way I hadn't previously in terms of sort of really following instincts about it. The last couple of films, time-based works that I made had a kind of central conceptual caveat, like, I'm making a film about a man that has 20 seconds of memory. It's on 16 millimeter. He had brain damage. The film can get damaged. It goes through one projector. 20 seconds later, it goes through another. How cool. There was never that kind of aha moment with this project, which was really uncomfortable for me. And a number of artist friends were tremendously supportive in saying, like, it's good to work in an uncomfortable space. It's good not to know what you're doing. But Gloria kind of came in maybe a month before it was done and sort of said, well, I see this is like signature Kerry Tribe. It's got you all over it, and you know how to finish this kind of work. And I mean, in a way, having, you know, all artists have lots of different audiences. And, you know, I think about, I was gratified that my children enjoy this show. I mean, they're featured in it, they sing in it, but they also want to sit with it. We had a great Kids Day event here where we had like 100 kids show up and make their own stop motion animations. But there's also always that audience of people who really know what you're doing and will tell you if you're fucking up. So it was really, really helpful that at a moment Gloria came in and said, like, you are okay, you know how to do this, and you kind of enunciated for me, as did Rita Gonzalez, all these connections to things I'd sort of done before that to me were these tangential, crazy things that nobody would ever see. So it was just gratifying. It's always gratifying to have a sounding board who knows your work with that kind of depth and has that kind of care for it. That's the first thing that comes to mind, was this kind of rescue moment of like Gloria coming to LA and saying, it's okay.
But we all do that for each other. I mean, I think that's what that idea of an intentional community is, in the sense that, you know, your harshest critic are the people that are close to that work, or Jenny Sorkin's work has been deeply influential to me, or having someone to read through this. And the highest compliment that Kerry could give me was this writing was so clear, because academic writing is so not clear, right? Or to think about why, you know, I wanted you to read certain passages at certain times, you know. So it's just like sharing work, I think, is the main thing. And then the last person, you know, or last point too is, you know, is to evoke, you know, something that I learned from Laura Owens, because she constantly would ask me, like, what does the work need, right? There's certain questions, and sometimes you need a sounding board, sometimes you need something outside, sometimes you need a public venue to vent something. And so one of the questions that I always think about is, you know, Laura Owens saying to me, like, what does the work need?
Well, and I have to say, she said the same thing to me. I mean, when we talked about doing a project here, and I kept saying, like, what are the parameters, and what, you know, and it was like, well, what does the work need? What does the work need? What does the work need? And that's, I mean, no one has ever said to me, what does the work need, with that kind of generosity, and like, what kind of programming do we need to do, and how can that, you know, how is this going to be what you need it to be and what the work needs? And I mean, one thing to the credit of the space is, which is also why, you know, and I think it's seeped into the work. I mean, obviously my piece foregrounds the space in lots of ways, but also, I mean, I don't know of any other place that, you know, I mean, like a Kids Day with most of the shows is kind of phenomenal. And for those of us that are balancing these multiple lives, it's also really important to feel like there's a space for an art historical discourse, you know, a very sort of fun and rudimentary discourse with kids. And we had a panel here. The first event we did was a panel that had all of the aphasic subjects of the film and the support group, and a speech pathologist participating, and a librarian, you know. And so for me, there's something funny about 356 Mission that really engenders, I mean, and you'll, like, if you look up, like, the show on Instagram, the hashtag, half of them are like, there's this amazing space behind Ooga Booga. I love it when stores have these cool back spaces when, like, they do a show, you know. And, like, I love, that's so great, you know. So I think that kind of, there's something very unfixed about this space. I think it is a kind of an intentional community that is, like, really special and precious.
Yeah, and I think especially for an artist too, and I look at Paul McCarthy, I look at a lot of people who have part of what I think of as that ethos is pointing to other voices at every turn. And I think that's one of the things I try to think about now, in terms of what are the stakes of work and scholarship, is pointing to those other voices.
That's why it seems so great to be talking about the Dome and an intentional community in what seems very much like the new manifestation of that too.
Yeah.
And the conversation between you both.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.